Hey, everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about avoiding RTA or the refuse to accept with the right medical device cybersecurity strategy. I'm going to share my screen so that you can easily see who is going to be speaking with us today. Just a moment. All right. So today we're going to be hearing from Shauna Monterey, Elisabeth George, and Zen Zalewski. These are professionals in the medtech space. And so some of you may be thinking, okay, well, why are we here exactly? What is this RTA? Well, on December 29th, 2022, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, also known as the Omnibus, was signed into law. One part of that omnibus was ensuring cybersecurity of medical devices, which amended the FDA, the FD&C Act to ensure cybersecurity of medical devices. Well, if you look at that guidance document, if you skip down the FDA's page a bit, it said the FDA generally intends not to refuse to accept decisions for pre-market submissions submitted for cyber devices based solely on information required by Section 524B of the FD&C Act before October 1st, 2023. So what does that mean? The assumption is after that, they will. So how do we avoid those things? That's what we're here to talk about today. And that's essentially what we want to discuss and get the experts' opinions on. So to start this conversation off, Shauna, do you want to talk a little bit about this date and what this even means?
Sure. So as you know, when you do an FDA or pre-market submission, it could be a 510K or any sort of pre-market submission with the FDA, including a PMA, de novo, breakthrough, et cetera. There's a checklist that FDA goes through as part of your submission. And so they go through what they call an RTA, refuse to accept, kind of a qualification checklist. And with that, if you don't meet the minimum requirements, they will issue within 15 days a refuse to accept. So what that means is you can go back and address those concerns within that time frame, or you can withdraw your submission. So prior to the date that Etienne mentioned is they weren't really upholding the cybersecurity requirements that were passed through law. They were giving you kind of a soft pass and was working with companies before they issued an RTA to address those concerns. And so now it's like a hard pass fail. You're either going to get accepted through the pre-sub process, or you're going to get kicked back with an RTA. That doesn't mean your submission has been rejected. It just means that it doesn't meet the minimum requirements for the review. And that's when I mentioned they'll let you know within the first 15 days, because what they don't want to do is to go into the full substantial equivalency review, primarily for the 510K, and then see that there's issues later along, and then you have this time clock that's ticking and whatnot. So the process is really like a quick check to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements. A few main things I want to point out is that there are requirements in law. And so the actual law itself basically is looking for three main things. And so as part of your submission, they want to make sure that you have a plan in place to address any post-market cyber issues. They also want to make sure you have processes in place to address those post-market issues. And they also want to make sure that you provide an SBOM, and an SBOM specifically is called out by the law, which is quite unusual. Usually there's guidance around what needs to be complied to, but not specifically like a named deliverable. And this actually calls out what's called an SBOM. It's required to provide to the Secretary of Software Bill of Materials.
So that was a lot, and I appreciate you going into some of that detail. We'll get into some more questions here in just a moment. I'm trying to stall just for a minute because I know Elisabeth George, she's having a little bit of technical difficulty. She should be here in just a moment. While I stall for just a brief moment, I want to encourage you, those of you who are listening, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We have a Q&A section. We'll try to weave those in if possible. If we don't get to all of your questions, we'll forward those on to the presenters later and they can follow up with you individually, but definitely put those Q&A, and I'd love to see one or two in there just so I know that it's working. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in there. It looks like we have Elisabeth with us as well. So now that this is in law, and that the clock is ticking, as it were, Ken, do you want to talk to us a little bit about, as a software as a medical device company, what some of those intricacies are? She mentioned the SBOM, the software bill of materials. What are some things that companies should be looking for as they prepare their submissions?
Yeah, thank you, Etienne. And so yeah, I love that answer, Shauna, and really kind of laying out the groundwork that the folks really need to pay attention to this. The guidance that's coming out, so the pre-market guidance and other things that are guiding folks towards what they need to submit. And exactly to your point, and one of the differentials that I see immediately that's it seems fairly obvious is now. The manufacturers need to submit plans to monitor after the device has been approved and fielded. So that's a big change. If you think about now, you've got to think ahead of time. So as a device manufacturer, you got to think ahead as to what your strategy is around monitoring vulnerabilities. And I just find a lot of manufacturers aren't prepared in that sense. So, going back to the kind of all the way back to the guidance that came out a few years back and then rolling forward to today, FDA with their pre-market guidance and appropriations act,
use my microphone.
all of the legislative acts and regulatory requirements around this are kind of moving us in that direction of being proactive. And so thinking about risk ahead of time, understanding threats, understanding what how you're going to communicate this to consumers of your products is all very, very important and a little bit different than what we're used to. So I'll stop there and let Shauna and Elisabeth, I see she's back on, chime in as well, because I'm sure they have some interesting thoughts as well.
Yeah, and maybe a question that I should have asked a little bit leading up to this is who should be considered a cyber device? And because oftentimes when I think cybersecurity, okay, I think it's a straight software as a medical device or a cloud connected device. Does it go beyond that? Do you have some insight as to who this is applicable, who this applies to? And either Shauna or Zen or Ken, whoever would like to answer.
I can comment on that. So it's any medical device, right? So the regulation says a device, right? And FDA then takes that and defines further what they consider is a medical device. So one, you need to be a medical device. That includes software. The other misconception that I've seen is that firmware is actually considered embedded software by the FDA. So FDA has a list of definitions, and around firmware, they specifically call it embedded software. And then if you look at the guidance documents, it'll actually include firmware in parentheses. So firmware is included as well. And the idea is, if you look at the language, it says is capable of being connected, which is very different than intended to be connected. So if your device can be connected, even if it's not intended to be connected, you still need to address cyber concerns. And just saying that it's not intended to be connected is simply not enough. You at least at a minimum need to conduct a risk assessment to show that there's actually minimum risk and minimum need for controls on your product. Just saying it's not going to be connected and putting that in your labeling is just, it's not sufficient.
Okay, that makes sense, and that helps to kind of get an understanding of who this is applicable to. And Ken, you mentioned the building that strategy. Could you give a little bit more insight as to why and what are some of the tangible business values behind that strategy when you're going to build it out? We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. We'll get to those in just a moment. Continue to put those in there. But what about some of the tangible business values for this?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it from a strategic perspective, right? I mean, there's a lot of, I think, motivation to check the box to be compliant, right? I mean, folks may do the knee-jerk reaction of saying, well, we need to submit these items to kind of get through this process. But I think that's kind of short-sighted. I think organizations need to think long-term and need to think how to bake this in. It's not going anywhere. Cybersecurity is here to stay. As Shauna mentioned, the software bill of materials, the plan to monitor vulnerabilities, that'll be continuous and ongoing. And so I think some of that thought has to come in beforehand and kind of strategically thought out with respect to how you're going to roll these processes going forward. And some of that is going to be different. So you think about organizations, medical device manufacturers have been dealing with safety issues forever and ever. Security is a little bit new to a lot of folks. And so start to plan that a little ahead of time. Think a little bit ahead as to how you might hang this security into the current infrastructure you have. Most folks are used to dealing with risk assessment frameworks. Look for natural alignments with the risk assessment from a safety perspective to a security perspective, but think about it ahead of time, just like you would think about safety. And I'd like to just expand a little bit on Shauna's point too, with respect to devices. I've seen that same mistake being made with devices that aren't intended to be connected, or even devices that legacy devices that don't have network connectivity. There's still risk inherent in those devices, right? And so the risk may be less, and surely is less if you can't get to it via network, but there is risk there. And so you can't just say there's no risk. There's got to be, threat models and risk assessments done on devices, regardless of whether they are networkable or are networked today, or those kind of things. And so it's a good point to bring that out, and don't forget that in your scoping with respect to the strategy as well.
Okay, good answer. Go ahead.
Ken, this is Elisabeth, and I just wanted to add a little bit to that comment. I think that one of the things with the RTA process is the FDA has been communicating to industry for a long time that the quality of what is being submitted is a key issue. It's not just the content, but the RTA was intended to help weed out really the documents that were missing the items that are intended to be there. So I think that what you and Shauna have said is that just saying not applicable or no, it doesn't, it's not in this submission is not appropriate, because I think a lot of people are assuming that even if they are a software device, if they're not changing the software in that submission, they're going to want to say not applicable, but they need to identify specifically why they're not impacting that with the change that they're making. And I know my apologies that I tripped off. It's horrible where I am. And one of the things that the whole purpose of the RTA was asking the FDA to go faster and submissions more effectively, and everything that we're expecting. And so the RTA was something we asked for as industry, saying, let's have a list of items that you want, a table. And, the FDA is telling us what they want in the and if you're not going to submit it, you need to really realize why.
Thanks, Elisabeth. You're cutting out a little bit there, so I don't know if we got all of it, but well, she cut out completely. To her point, though, she was kind of talking about some of the changes that could be made, and we actually have a question in the chat that may be relevant. So if we can answer that one, this one comes from David Shanes. If my firmware is not upgradable on the device, then how do I have a process in place for addressing post-market cyber issues? Is that if that's relevant? What are your thoughts to that question?
Yeah, I guess it's probably not field upgradable, which means it can be upgraded in some way. At the end of the day, what you want to do is kind of assess potential new threats, right? And so when you're looking at your product post-market, post-launch, you want to consider anything that can impact the device. And so I think from a fixed purely embedded system that's fixed and closed, you want to just make sure that you're looking at any sort of vulnerabilities with third-party software that you're using, any issues with even like the chipset and stuff like that, so that you're ongoing looking at kind of complaints and potential issues disclosed by your third-party software vendors. If it's purely custom, the same thing, right? You just want to monitor what's happening out in the field to see if there's any new potential threats, and then have a plan in place to mitigate those threats. And so same thing as if you had a safety issue, right? If you can't upgrade the firmware, how would you actually address a class 1 recall if the firmware is not upgradable, right? You might have to recall all the devices. And so I think looking at future, right, you want to future-proof your product, it'd be more cost-effective to provide a mechanism to be able to upgrade your devices. In some cases, if they're disposable, really cheap and inexpensive, some of these wearable devices are really inexpensive, just replacing them might be satisfactory.
Is that something industry has pushed back on, or have you seen any comments about that? Just with the I don't know, practical side of actually recalling those devices for upgrading that firmware?
We have seen that. Yeah, I've been in a recall where we couldn't upgrade the firmware, and we actually had to create a specific adapter. We can upgrade it internally in-house. And so what we ended up doing, instead of recalling the devices or having field service go out there and upgrade the firmware, what we ended up doing is creating like a dongle that could connect them to the devices. And it was significantly less expensive. I think the recall was about $30 million recall if we had to send field service out there. And so we ended up investing, several million for this dongle, and then we ended up distributing that so that it can be upgraded by our customers. And so I have seen that. I mean, we're moving from a place of like everything's closed, right? Let's manage risk by keeping the whole box closed. And when it can get into it, we control the operating system, we control the drivers, we control the interfaces. And now we're going to cloud-based connected applications, right? There's really a drive for that. There's a need for that. There's a utility for that. Now, when that opens things up, you have this open ecosystem that you can't control, especially if you're in the cloud. So we're moving away from that. And with devices that are out there, especially with large install bases, these are really old legacy devices. And if you look at like the post-market surveillance guidance or the post-market cybersecurity guidance by the FDA, legacy isn't quite touched yet. And you can see in the omnibus, when they actually published it, there was some conversation around legacy devices. And what they had said was in the next couple years, they're going to come up with something in relation to legacy devices, because they don't want to disrupt industry, right? FDA doesn't want to put something in place that's going to disrupt, ventilation and these key like critical health applications that are really old legacy devices. And so there needs to be a solution for that. But at the end of the day, it's based on risk, right? Risk versus, patient safety versus benefit from having the clinical utility out there. So that's kind of how you have to look at things.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a fantastic answer, Sean. And I think I would just add a little bit to that with respect to moving ahead and looking at other parts of the world that have come out with some kind of verbiage around legacy. So International Medical Device Regulators Forum released a document with a framework around supporting a legacy device. And I think, FDA, to your point, will do something very similar. But if you think about it, and what IMDRF is saying in their legacy device document is it's about communication and having a plan. So it's kind of the same things we're talking about, the blocking and tackling. So saying, okay, we've got open systems, we've got more vulnerable systems because of connectivity and a broader user base, maybe. So we need to start thinking about this ahead of time and planning, and then communicating that. To your point, continuously monitoring and looking for vulnerabilities in devices that are fielded, and then communicating that with consumers. And I think it seems common sense-ish, but I think that's the direction we'll go with respect to a lot of these guidance and what FDA will kind of look for going forward as well.
So you mentioned communicating those vulnerabilities, and kind of my mind goes to the SBOM a little bit. We had a question about the SBOM. Is there a standardized SBOM template available that will ensure all information necessary is included? What are your thoughts about that? You're on mute, Ken.
Oh, I'm sorry.
All right.
I can start there and then others can jump in with respect to SBOM. So there are standards today. So if you look at NTIA's movement with respect to SBOM, they've been running that SBOM project for a few years. They've come out with a list of minimum elements that you can find fairly readily. And then there are also standard formats for the SBOM. So there's Cyclone DX and SPDX. And the bottom line is provide those minimum elements in a format that can be consumed. And we hear a lot about machine readable versus human readable. And I've heard multiple different scenarios around that. So I've heard organizations that have submitted information machine readable and then have been asked to also submit a human readable format as well. So I know organizations that are submitting both SPDX or say Cyclone DX SBOMs along with say PDF versions of SBOM. So there are standard formats. You can check out NTIA if you haven't seen those yet, list for the common elements or the elements that need to be described within an SBOM. But I'll stop there and let others comment on that as well.
Yeah, so there's also the draft FDA guidance 2022. So there's a current guidance, right? that's been approved. And then there's the draft guidance that got published in 2022. And it actually has a whole section on SBOM, and it itemizes out like recommended elements and items of the SBOM as well. So even though it's not released, it could also be used for where FDA is headed on that and what their thought process is around the SBOM.
Okay, great. I've heard a lot of talk about that that guidance document. I don't want to get us too far off from our original RTA guidance, so we'll kind of come back to that a little bit. Maybe we can include some of those in the follow-up email, some links. Julio asked though about the FDA draft cybersecurity guidance. Well, since we're on that topic, he asked whether it's already being enforced, or what's your take on that before we kind of move on, I guess.
I have a school of thought. I've been clearing regulated devices since the early 2000s. And so even though and we're accredited third-party review organization as well, right? So we're only supposed to look at approved final draft guidances. That's the claim, right? But what I've seen is in every submission that the guidance is like moving towards current thinking, and you'll start seeing a lot of questions come in that are based on the guidance, and the justification could be like, how are you able to show A, B, and C that's in the current guidance, right? But it gets more technical. And so if you look at the current guidance, it's 9 pages, very high level, right? It talks about, identify, detect, etc. And it doesn't really go into any issues around threat modeling, mitigations, general features that are expected or best practices. And so if you look at the draft guidance, is almost 50 pages, and it goes into very specific technical detail, and there's a lot around threat modeling. And so what we have seen with submissions that we have helped support with our clients is there's a lot of questions around threat modeling, justifying which approach you used, why, risk assessment. There's all kinds of digging in that are more aligned with the draft guidance. And so my recommendation is to consider both. Make sure you're compliant with the final guidance, the current active one, but be ready to answer questions around more of the technical aspects and be able to justify, if you're not doing a threat model, why is that, and what approach did you use to mitigate and to identify and mitigate any cyber threats, potential intentional or unintentional threats. So that's something just to kind of keep in mind. It's not a good answer, I know that, but I think in general, like if the guidance is coming out, this is any day now before they start adopting, and you can kind of start seeing trends towards that.
Yeah, and I think you might have answered the question that Shane actually asked, which cybersecurity guidance should be used when submitting: the 2014 guidance, the 2018 draft, or the 2022? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 2014, the 2022 replaces the 2018, so don't even read that one. And then the 2022, as I mentioned, like it needs to be considered, definitely, because the feedback that we're seeing is all around primarily threat modeling. There's a big focus on threat modeling. And there's actually a playbook that FDA references from MITRE. And we can send the reference later, but there's a MITRE playbook all about threat modeling.
Okay. Then, Ken, did you have a follow-up?
No, I was going to say that's a great answer. I would definitely agree with Shauna, looking at obviously complying with guidance that's in force today, but also looking at what's coming out and preparing for that. I mean, what we're seeing also at Vigilant is organizations that are kind of clinging to the old processes and not jumping into that foray yet. And the pre-market guidance has been drafted, has been out there for a lot of years. It will drop as a final guidance at some point soon. So we can't pretend it's not going to be there with the requirements that it has. And as Shauna mentioned, it's way longer than the drafts that have been out there already. So, prepare yourself for that and kind of start to align with that and be as proactive as you can.
Okay. So if we kind of bring it back to the RTA, Lavinia asked the question, what best practices can manufacturers adopt to ensure their submissions comply with the RTA criteria? What are your thoughts? I don't know if we want to start with, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can answer that. There's actually a checklist, and it's pretty easy to follow. And then the E-Star, I don't know if that came out yet, but everything's going to be electronic. So it's supposed to actually be able to do a self-audit. It still won't alleviate the human aspect of reviewing the submission for RTA, but the intent is that electronic format which I recommend using, will catch any gaps that you have, at least initially, in terms of providing the documentation. But the guidance is really clear. There's actually a minimum, I forget the name of it. There's the RTA. If you read that one, it actually referenced then the requirements for the submission. And it's pretty easy to follow. It's a checklist. I mean, it's exhaustive, but it's pretty easy to follow.
Okay. And I'm trying to keep notes so that we can keep track of all the different references we'll try to follow up with. So just keep an eye out for a follow-up email with some of that information. Lavinia asked the question, how does the FDA RTA policy compare to similar policies in other regulatory agencies worldwide? Do you have any thoughts from a global perspective?
Related to cybersecurity or just the submission process in general?
Well, she didn't specify, or they didn't specify cybersecurity. Either one, however you want to answer, I'm sure would be fine.
I'll just focus on cybersecurity. So the old trend used to be like, let's just follow FDA, right? And then EU started actually creating more rigor, more standards, right? Like the IEC standards generally have been adopted by the FDA as recognized consensus standards. But what we're seeing is every country is now creating their own guidances. So it's no longer like, oh, we just follow whatever the FDA has, and here's our little subset of stuff that we also want to see. They're actually creating their new standards. And what's interesting is that with the separation of like, your UK from EU, they're actually creating their own standards as well around cyber. And so what's interesting is you can read them all and they're all kind of saying the same thing, but then there's nuances and subtleties that you have to be careful. And so that's going to be really important. And then there's also other, organizations that are creating harmonization on top of that to try to make it even easier, which ends up making it even more complex because you're like, which one do I follow? And so from a cyber perspective, I know most countries are creating something of their own or recognizing the some sort of NIST standard or IEC. I know in the US, there's a big initiative on revamping the NIST standards around cybersecurity. Right now, they're more applicable to the federal government, and what they want to do is extend it even across to be applicable for medical devices. That's a big initiative. They just put about $50 million into that, so it's highly funded, and so we'll see some changes there. And the NIST tries to take a national kind of global approach and get adoption globally, so we'll see where that goes, but I think we're a couple years away from that.
Yeah, and I agree with that with respect to regions around the world kind of doing their own thing at this point. And Shauna, right on the money with this respect to kind of straying away from the we'll do what FDA does model. I know folks like Health Canada have had their pre-market guidance out for a couple of years now and requiring SBOM and requiring the pre-market information that FDA is now kind of getting to. So yeah, I mean, these regions are kind of taking the leap and doing their own thing. A lot of it is common, and I know there are organizations out there like DITA and others that are doing alignment of these documents and requirements to hopefully make it easier for folks to consume. But it is worthwhile to look at, if you're doing business around the world commercially, look at the regions that you're doing business in and specifically look at the details of their requirements, because in some aspects they may differ a little bit. So yeah, it's a good thought.
Okay, great. Jim asked the question, can you advise on gold standard practices and tools for starting, processing assessments, and also tracking threats and issues? What should people aspire to rather than what is the minimum viable product for cybersecurity? For example, Microsoft threat modeling tools, soup tracking, et cetera, or yeah, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can start, I guess. So yeah, what we see at Vigilant. So Vigilant Ops makes an automation solution around cybersecurity with a software bill of materials. So there are tools out there and vendors out there that do have tools that are specific to providing required documentation or automating some of that process. The heavy lift in a lot of this is going to be vulnerability monitoring on a continuous basis. So if you think about understanding where the vulnerabilities exist, not only in the components that you're building into your systems, but then with respect to components that you're looking at sourcing maybe for future versions of your systems. So you think about the entire supply chain kind of up and down there and understanding the security of each of those components. It becomes a complex issue. And so getting out ahead of that with respect to monitoring your vulnerabilities, understanding and assessing at a detailed level where the security issues may lie in the architecture of your products, and building that in upstream, is as far upstream as you can, is really important. So software bill of materials is there for a reason. It's because it provides that transparency into the vulnerabilities in given components, and enables that continuous monitoring. Again, the heavy lift is if you're trying to do that manually, if you're trying to get vulnerabilities for components that you're utilizing, you're facing that uphill struggle of continuously searching, and vulnerabilities come out every day. I think 50 plus are being added to NBD, as we speak, on a daily basis. So look for tools. There are tools that are available today that help you automate a lot of that process.
Okay. There's a question about 81. Well, actually, before I get to that one, I kind of have a question myself about lessons learned. I'm curious if we have any examples going back to this RTA or just cybersecurity in general. Any examples of how companies may have missed the mark and how it's impacted them, just in your experiences, whether Sean or Ken, whoever wants to answer first?
Yes, I mentioned a few, right? One is like assuming firmware is not software. So firmware is considered software by the FDA. The other one is assuming not intended to be connected and the ability to connect are the same thing. They are not. So just because it's not intended to connect, as long as it has the ability to connect, it needs to be looked at from a cybersecurity perspective. Like just consider like a USB port, right? If it's exposed, you might not consider that a connectivity feature, but if it's exposed and not used, it could be a source of vulnerability, right? You can load some software that can auto launch and then just destroy corrupt the entire system. So that's something to be aware of, right? Anything that's open is considered, that's accessible is considered a vulnerability, regardless if it's used or not. The other one I would say is not providing enough information to the FDA to evaluate your cybersecurity architecture and your risk mitigations. And so you may have to provide more information around your cybersecurity architecture and then your threat modeling that you used and justification around that, so that the FDA can make that evaluation. So not providing enough design specifications as well. Even though it's not required, you need to provide enough so that FDA can do a proper review. Another one I would say, which is I think a big one, and I think people aren't utilizing this feature, or I guess a service that FDA provides, but they have the Q submission program. So it's free. And so you can go to the FDA with your questions and even show them what your strategy is, and even discuss, your cybersecurity approach to see if you can get, to get initial feedback to see if you're headed in the right direction or if there's any like obvious risk. That program is free, and I see that being somewhat underutilized. I think a lot of people are using it for the clinical aspects, but you can use it for the cyber aspects and AI and whatnot to get early feedback from the FDA. And then one more I'll mention is that some customers sell into the hospital systems, and they assume because they have IT that the clients or their customers are responsible for cybersecurity. That's just not the case. Medical device security is a shared responsibility, even with your stakeholders and your customers and your end users. We're all responsible for cybersecurity.
Yeah, and I was actually gonna say that was a great last point there that made Sean. Well, the whole thing was good, and I like the last point with shared responsibility. So I think I've seen that same kind of mistake being made, the assumption that we're building this device to be deployed on a secure network with this level of security, authentication, decryption, encryption, whatever it happens to be. And I don't think you can make that assumption. I think you need to communicate how the device should be deployed in order to secure it in the best way possible. But the details around that, and understanding that that is a shared responsibility, and understanding that once deployed on the network, it may not be deployed exactly as you've specified. And so kind of taking that into account when you put the device documentation together is important for your customers. Yeah.
Great points. And you made me think, so there's actually a question, made me think maybe this could be relevant. This is an anonymous attendee who asked, is there a hard requirement for a machine readable SBOM, or would a non-machine readable document be acceptable? And I think they're asking for a regulatory requirement. You mentioned the NTIA minimum elements of an SBOM, but could you also include maybe what you've seen in the industry from if you want to commercialize to a hospital, they may have their own hard requirements above and beyond a regulatory requirement. So I don't know, either way you want to answer that. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I can start on that. I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the consumer may ask us for things above and beyond. FDA is asking for machine readable format of an SBOM. So the idea there is the consumption of the SBOM won't be as onerous, right? So if you give somebody an Excel spreadsheet with thousands of components, it's a little rigorous to go through. But if you give them something that they're able to pull in as a standard format, like I mentioned, CycloneDX and SPDX are the accepted formats. And so folks will be ready to consume those. And that would be the idea, to kind of make that consumption easy or easier, let's say. With respect to consumers, though, don't be surprised if your customers or consumers ask for information above and beyond what satisfies the regulatory requirements. I've seen that. That's been happening for a lot of years already. I mean, so the customers want to know, and they may get more rigorous, and I'm sure they will get more rigorous around security of devices that they're deploying on their network, understanding, again, plans to support those going forward, how you're continuously monitoring those, all those things that you really need to spell out in detail. So I would be prepared, again, to answer those questions a little, even above and beyond regulatory requirements.
Okay. Peter asked the question about shared responsibility. He's asking, does this affect the limit of reduced risk as far as possible? Does that, as far as possible, stop once a reduction of patient benefit would be caused? Let me see here. I'll just see if I can finish this one. It's moving around on me. Like saying, product must not be connected to insecure network. So is that since it's not a direct harm to the patient, it may just be a business harm to the consumer. Does that not necessarily need to be reduced, or what are the thoughts when it comes to risk management as far as reducing some of those risks?
Well, you always want to trace it back to patient safety, right, and patient harm. So that's one, right, likelihood of occurrence and all of that. So at the end of the day, your goal is, or focus is to decrease the likelihood that a device functionality, either intentionally or unintentionally, is compromised by inadequate cybersecurity. So that's actually coming from the guidance. So you want to make sure that that's your overarching goal. When you think of cybersecurity, though, there's patient harm from a safety perspective, like delayed results, no results, inaccurate results, right? Those common things that we generally look at when developing a medical device. But now from a cybersecurity perspective, there's also data privacy, right? So you want to make sure that the patient protected health information is also protected as well. So it's not just the patient safety from a diagnostic perspective or a harm or illness or misuse type of issue. Now you're looking at actually data privacy as well. So it has those two aspects to it.
Okay. Ken, there was kind of a follow-up question to your statement about the SBOM with the machine readable. So I just want to give you a chance to clarify here. They asked, did I hear that both a machine readable SBOM and a human readable SBOM is required by the FDA?
No, not currently required. And actually, well, if you think about it, with the guidance kind of not being finalized yet, right? If you can look back at the 2014 guidance, you can kind of go by that. But machine readable is what you should prepare today. I was actually making the statement that in some cases, I've seen device manufacturers do both machine readable and human readable and submit both of those. That's not required. You may get asked for that. It may be asked for by a consumer. FDA themselves may even ask for that as well, depending on who's reviewing the submission. You may get asked for that, but it would just be fairly easy to produce that human readable if you've got the machine readable. But no, the only requirement really is the machine readable SBOM. So I hope that clarifies.
Stephanie asked more of a question about the standards. She's asking, what about the ISO 81001-5 part where it talks about security? She says, we've heard that FDA is recommending the standard. What are your thoughts?
I'm not sure. I'd have to actually look that up. So I think the key is if FDA is recommending it, it's going to be cited in the 2014 version. If you look at the 2022 version, there are references to other standards. NIST is specifically mentioned. I know that. And then I know the MITRE playbook, which is not a guidance at all or a standard, is specifically mentioned. But in terms of the ISO, I'm not sure. Yeah, so if
Okay.
it's mentioned in there, you can assume that FDA is recommending it as a consensus standard, but you don't have to adhere to it. It's just an easier way for you guys to show, for anyone to show compliance, right? If you follow the standards, you get certified against the standards, and that's like kind of a good check in the box where FDA is like, okay, they're solid, right? But you can satisfy the guidance in other ways, right? You don't necessarily have to, like the recognized consensus standards, you don't have to adhere to. It's what you're going to claim that you adhere to in terms of claiming compliance to facilitate your approval and to facilitate the review. But you, as long as you can show that you're compliant, then and you're addressing FDA's concerns, and then you're covered. You can do it in any way you choose. It's not mandated, I guess, if that makes sense. It helps, but they're not mandated.
Yeah, and I was just gonna, yeah, that's right. And I would just add to that typically it's not prescriptive as to how you do things, and so there's no specific details requiring you to adhere to these standards. But as Shauna pointed out, they're good guidelines, guidances, and if you follow those, you should be, I guess, viewed in good light, let's say, with respect to FDA requirements.
Yeah, and just like any other standard, right? If you look at 62304, you can claim compliance or not. If you claim compliance, is a good way to show, okay, this is how we decided to implement these guidance documents, as we're following IEC 62304, which is recognized consensus standards. The same type of thing there.
Yeah, I mean, you think about any of these frameworks or guidances as kind of shorthand ways, excuse me, for FDA to say, we agree with the structure of this requirement or this regulation, or this guidance, and if you followed that structure, then we agree that you're doing the right thing, let's say. So
yeah, and I'd add on to say, if you're selling into like hospital systems or even companies that have really strong IT policies, they may require certain standards. And so they may even require certification against those standards. And so from a market perspective, you may see your competitors complying to those, but it may not be driven from the FDA or approval requirements. It may be more driven for marketing purposes.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we didn't talk about that very much yet, but there's another aspect to all this compliance and this regulatory and legislative stuff with respect to at the end of the day, what does your organization look like to your consumers? And complying with all this is a regulatory requirement, of course, but at the end of the day, you also want to provide the best security posture you can to your consumers. So understanding at the level of how this benefits and how this protects the patient, and then communicating that even just above and beyond the regulatory requirements that we've been talking about is just good business and good business practice. So again, this goes back to not just checking the box, but actually thinking it through from a strategic perspective, because there's an impact on the entire organization, from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I'd like that. I'd like to add to that a little bit too. If you think about goals and benefits beyond compliance, like you want to protect patients and put them at ease, right? So a lot of patients do have concern over their heart monitor being hacked and adjusted in such a way that they're threatened, right? Those are real fears. So you want to consider things beyond compliance that are just good for business, right? And good for your end users and your customers, users, right? Which are the patients. And so I think, being cyber secure could be even deemed a competitive advantage, right? So you can differentiate yourself from your competitors. You can reduce unnecessary regulatory costs and even faster device approval by being more rigorous, a quicker time to market as well, increase customer adoption, getting into markets where your competitors can't, like really complicated IT government systems, for example. They're very heavy on complying with recognized standards and whatnot. And then even, thinking even further on the post-market aspect is thinking ahead and reducing the risk of recalls. Recalls are very expensive. I don't know what the number is. I don't know if it's like times 10 or times 30, but it's really, or even times 100. I don't know what the cost is, but it's significantly more than your original R&D cost, right, to address a recall. So if you're looking at things, proactively, like in advance of your launch and planning for these things. And then so you can reduce your chances of recalls, or being able to enable the, to be able to address a recall by enabling patches and stuff like that. You're going to be way ahead.
Yeah, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yeah,
So
I forget what it's a huge number. It's a big difference. Like recalls are very expensive.
you made me think of something about we don't, you may not think that you are you need to be cybersecurity and so forth, but we don't talk about breaches necessarily that much, or you hear about the really big ones. But I'm curious, is there a way to do some sort of is there a database somewhere of security breaches or things like this, kind of like the mod databases for adverse events and so forth? Is there anything like that, or is there anything coming? Just kind of curious.
Well, I'll start with the vulnerabilities today. If you just think about it from a vulnerability perspective, the National Vulnerability Database is the biggest source of vulnerabilities currently today. And I know the government is pouring more money into that to sustain it going forward. And so folks report vulnerabilities to the NVD, and they get published there with severity scores and things. And so looking at the NVD will help you understand the vulnerabilities and components that you may be using. In terms of breaches that are actually happening, that's kind of more after the fact. That's like reactive, right? So you're looking at data, and there are places where you can dig that data up. I mean, there are streams, you can subscribe to streams and security streams to look at breaches that will give you information about breaches, even though a technical level, and you can understand the components involved and how the breach was how it occurred. But again, it's fairly reactive. So you want to kind of move upstream from that and say, I'm going to look at this from the component perspective, what I'm using in my systems and the vulnerabilities and the risk that I'm taking today by having those components in there at the level that they are. So Shauna mentioned security patches and things like that. Those should all be part of your planning and monitoring ahead of time, looking at sources like NVD for vulnerabilities, understanding the timing involved with the vulnerability, and then your process internally for getting a patch together and out to the customer. All things FDA cares about, by the way. Metrics with respect to how quickly you respond, those are all things FDA is going to want you to keep track of.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned the mod database. So there are cyber issues in there. They're just not classified. So they're hard to kind of know whether it was the cause of a cyber breach or whatnot, because it's not necessarily specific. There might be some in there, but currently the mod database, unfortunately, isn't classified by cybersecurity issues. It'd be nice, but it's not. But it's still a source of input that you should be considering regardless, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. They might be buried in there, but they're not easily, you can't easily sort by it.
Okay. Another question from an anonymous attendee was, is it appropriate to include a post-market plan for cyber within the threat model? And maybe we could just kind of address post-market surveillance while we're at it.
Yeah, it's actually a requirement to show what you're going to do from a post-market perspective. Yeah, so they do want to see your post-market plan, right? Whether or not your post-market processes and all that are all built out, they do want to know how you're going to manage some threats and vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Yep.
We've kind of
yeah, go
ahead.
As I mentioned, I'm sorry, Etienne. As I mentioned, there's also additional detail required with respect to how you respond to vulnerability. So the metrics around that. So understanding when you know of a vulnerability, and then how you responded to your consumers with respect to that vulnerability, how quickly you got patches out, and then how quickly all the field devices were patched. So think about tracking that kind of detail level as well as part of your plan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and there's two guidances from the FDA. There's the pre-market and post-market. I highly suggest understanding the post-market when you do your pre-market submission to make sure that you're accounting for all the elements that they're requiring in your plan.
Good point.
Yeah, it might be worthwhile to talk about if you want to talk. I know you mentioned a checklist. Were you talking about the general checklist earlier, the general RTA checklist, Shauna, or is one specific to cybersecurity? I don't know if you remember.
There isn't one specific to cyber. It's just the RTA checklist, which calls out all the elements required for your submission.
That's what I thought you were talking about. So if it might be worth talking about, just we touched on it, but maybe tips on building a strategy, what needs to be included in this, and then maybe Sean, maybe we start with you, Ken, and I'll buy you a little bit of time while you think about it. And Shauna, maybe we could then talk also about omissions that you've seen or typical things people mess up on. Ken, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, so if you want to, I think the question was, what do you think about when you start to build your strategy, your cybersecurity strategy? The first thing that I always like to think about is scoping. I think this is a big undertaking for a lot of organizations, especially if they're large organizations with multiple products or say legacy or fielded devices along with products they're coming out with. And so one of the things that I do when I work with manufacturers is to scope. To take this exercise and scope it first. So look at critical risks in your organization and start to prioritize those as part of your strategy, right? So it's kind of like an assessment of where you are today as kind of the foundation or baseline to any good strategy. And then I think from there, you start to build out the pieces of it. And if you look at your safety framework that you have today as a manufacturer, a lot of the elements are in place that you can kind of align with from a security perspective and think about it. Again, at the end of the day, it all boils down to patient safety in the same way. So security aligns with safety at some point. And so if you kind of use that as a jumping off point as well, I think you can get a good start on a strategy. But also remember, the strategy should be pliable and flexible. We're in an evolving ecosystem. SBOM is brand new to a lot of folks. I mean, FDA has been talking about it for 4 years or 5 years, but security is still a new topic to a lot of folks in med device. And so it's continuously evolving. So build your strategies flexibly enough so that you can modify processes and policies to reflect the current ecosystems as they evolve.
Shauna, what are some things you've seen people leaving out, just maybe some typical pitfalls and omissions? And I know we'll have to wrap this up here in a moment, but any tips?
Threat model is a big one. Yeah, even though it's not specifically called out, that's a big one. And so when you think about the threat modeling, or if you think about cybersecurity in general, like I think my biggest tip is integrated in just like you integrate risk management, right? It starts at planning and ends when your product is retired. So it starts at planning and it continues on through sustaining. So every aspect of your software development lifecycle or your product development process should integrate cybersecurity, including user needs, right? What are the needs of your users? What environments is your product going to be deployed in? What are their IT requirements, right? And how do you, from a user perspective, consider cyber without actually making your product difficult to use, right? In some cases, you can lock down certain capabilities and features to make your product cyber secure, but yet make your product unusable. Right. So you want to integrate all that through. I always think from a cyber perspective that the cyber architecture is key because that's input then into your risk assessment. And so focus a lot on the architectural model. And there's actually in the new guidance, the draft guidance of 2022, there's some examples of different architectural views that you can use to model your cybersecurity of your product. And that's very helpful to look at it in different views so you can understand the threats and the areas of vulnerability. So I think that's really important, is to consider everything from an architectural viewpoint first. Also, in terms of how you're designing your product, is to decompose it in such a way so that you can easily manage threats, right? And so the old days, everything's like one image, you deploy everything on one environment, you have full control, but that doesn't allow you to patch a system very quickly, especially if it's one little subsystem. And if you don't understand how those things operate and you're deploying everything as a whole, you have to do full V&V all over again. Right. But if you're looking at something and you have a nicely decomposed system, you can patch a subsystem like a web service or something like that, or a third-party tool, understand where the other aspects of the system are impacted and do appropriate regression testing around that and get your patches out faster. And so when we deploy these whole images, right, of this is the software, includes the operating system, right, it's just this big binary blob of something, it's really difficult to patch and it takes a long time to get it out. So the more modular you develop your product around those risks, the faster you can respond to the market without hindering the rest of the product or requiring you to go back to the very beginning. You can look at it from a regression, kind of more of a validation approach in that sense.
Okay. Very cool. I appreciate you giving that wrap up. I'm I'm going to share my screen one more time just so you can kind of see some of the takeaways that we've been talking through. Obviously, it starts at the planning phase. You should focus on prevention. And I liked what Ken said about having a pliable and evolving strategy. And then, of course, analyze those submissions prior to providing them to the FDA, because you don't want to be stopped on an RTA. That's an admin review. You shouldn't have to have that happen. So Shauna gave some great advice to that. Now, there was lots of questions about the software's bill of materials. So there is a special promotional offer that Vigilant Ops, our today's sponsor, is offering. So we'll include this link, but www.vigilant-ops.com/get-started-here. You can check out that promotional offer about the SBOM and vulnerability monitoring and management. So check that out. Want to thank you all for all of your questions. Just a quick reminder to those of you who asked questions, there's some really detailed ones in there, and I wanted to get to those, but I felt bad we didn't have Elisabeth's backup. So again, thank you, Shauna and Ken, for filling in for her due to those technical issues. But we will forward all of those questions from you, our audience, onto the presenters so that they can get those answers back to you, and we'll try to get all of those things answered. Thank you so much for your engagement. Ken, Shauna, thank you so much for being with us today. We'll let you all get back to the rest of your day. Everybody take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.